This is it, everybody. Here we go. Welcome. This is Matt Connarton Unleashed, the AF version of the show, MCU AF. And as I always like to say, if you don't know what the AF stands for, just ask someone younger than you. But this is a version of the show, and today's going to be a very unusual version of the show. But the podcast version, we do as kind of it's a supplement to the actual radio show. The radio show we do of Matt Connarton Unleashed every Saturday morning from 9 a.m. to noon from the studios of WMNH 95.3 FM in glorious Manchester, New Hampshire. But the podcast version we do separate. It is strictly online. And the purpose of the podcast version of the show is really just to do anything that we want to do on the show that for one reason or another, we just is just not going to fit the current format of the radio show. So we only do the podcast version of the show occasionally, but that's what this is. Now, I was tempted to just do the stream and not call it Matt Connarton Unleashed, not even call it that, but I am going to put it out in the podcast feed. So people who subscribe to the show will get it and it'll make sense in a moment when I tell you what we're doing, even though we're doing something unusual. So this was not advertised at all. I kind of decided in the moment a few minutes ago that now is the time. It's something that's been kicking around in my mind for a while. Again, this will all make sense. I'm sorry if I'm being cryptic. I'm getting to it, but for anyone who happens to be streaming the show live, because most people will just get it in the podcast after the fact. But if you are joining me live, today is Sunday, January 25th, Sunday, January 25th, 2026, as the country is in the midst of a terrible, terrible storm. And I hope everyone is safe here in Manchester, New Hampshire, where I am right now. I did some shoveling earlier, and I plan to do some more shoveling in a little bit because trying to stay ahead of it, trying to keep up with it as best as possible, which is not easy to do. But we're lucky here. I mean, at least we're prepared for weather events here, in some parts of the country. Obviously in the South, they're not prepared for anything like this, in places like Texas and Arkansas, where they're experiencing, ice and even a little bit of snow there can really mess things up for them because they're not prepared for it. So, but we're having quite a storm. So I hope everyone is safe as you can be. So what we're doing today is, this is why, and again, I didn't tell anybody ahead of time. It's been on my mind all day that it might finally be time to do this. This is going to be a little bit difficult, and I've been putting it off for, been about 5 weeks now. But my father, as some of you watching or listening will know, my dad, Martin Connarton, passed away on December 18th, 2025. And on the show that Saturday, on the radio show, because I still, of course, I still did the radio show that Saturday, because, it's a terrible cliche and it sounds so trite, but the show must go on, as they say. And, I just, the best way for me to process grief also is just to stay busy. I'm just checking to make sure the audio is okay here. Okay, I was just checking on my phone just to make sure. I had a little issue with the microphone, the mic setup before going on. So I said on the show that Saturday, I opened and I kind of did a sort of a brief, maybe 10, 12 minutes, just talking about my dad sorry, I'm looking in the camera and realizing how chapped my lips are and how terrible that looks. I'm almost unintentionally, I don't mean to do it, but it's like now that I'm doing this, I'm procrastinating on getting to it. All right. It's hard. So I talked on the show about my dad, and I partly because I just wanted to, because I'd been public on social media about everything that was going on with him. He'd been at Mass General for a couple of months. but I wanted to publicly thank everybody for the outpouring of love and support, which really does mean a lot to me. And I also said when I talked about my dad, again, relatively briefly that morning, I said that when I was ready, I was going to do a separate podcast version of the show, a podcast episode of the show where I could just do a stream and just speak freely and say everything that I wanted to say. And I felt like it was easier and perhaps more productive to do it in this format than to do it on the radio show. Only because to do it live on the radio show, you got to kind of, I mean, we have a busy show. And I didn't want to schedule it into the show. Okay, on this day in this segment, I'm going to do this. And then have the pressure of, first of all, on that day, when it's time for that segment, I have to be emotionally prepared for it. I didn't want that pressure, and I didn't want, to be worried about, okay, who's the guest who's coming up in the next segment. I only have so much time to say this. I didn't want any of that. I just wanted to be able to just speak freely, and it's as long or as short as it's going to be, because it's not the radio show, because it's just the podcast, it's a stream. It can be whatever I want. So, it could be 20 minutes, it could be an hour, it doesn't matter. And I can just say what I want to say. If at some point I feel like, not that this is going to happen, but if at some point during this, I feel like I'm not emotionally able to continue, I just don't, if I start to feel like, oh, this was a mistake, I thought I was ready, I'm not ready, I can dump out of it and say, well, thanks everybody who joined us live, but I'm not going to finish this right now. So I do see that we have some people who have joined us live, and welcome everybody. And the chat room is open, by the way, if anyone wants to chime in, if anyone has anything to say regarding my dad. But I did say that on the radio. I said, when I'm ready, I will do a podcast episode. I will do a live stream, which of course the audio will be taken and made into the podcast episode of the show. And it's been what, 5 weeks now? Because he passed away on December 18th. I didn't expect it to be, by the way, I didn't expect it to be that long before I did this. But so something happened the other night. So I'm going to start here and kind of work backward a little bit. But and by the way, too, because some people might be curious or might be confused about something. So there's a specific reason that I think it's appropriate. Because if you don't know, this might all seem a little self-indulgent to you or a little narcissistic on my part. And maybe it is. I mean, I got to be a little bit narcissistic, right? Because anyone who hosts a podcast or a radio show, there has to be some element of narcissism in one's personality to believe that other human beings are interested in what we have to present. So that comes with it, right? That is an element of my personality. I acknowledge that, for better or worse. But I felt it appropriate because a lot of listeners to the radio show over the years became familiar with my dad. And some of you formed parasocial, I guess might be the term, relationships with my dad. And I don't say that to be dismissive or anything like that, but that's, many of you got to know my dad, not because you met him in person or anything, but because you got to know him on social media. My dad would call into the show, and then people would friend him on Facebook, for example, and so forth. So because so many of you knew him that way, I thought, people might like to hear what I have to say about him in some detail. But also selfishly, and again, perhaps narcissistically, but selfishly, I just thought it would be good for me to do this and to just kind of say everything that I want to say about him. If you're consuming this content and that's not interesting to you, I completely understand. I'm doing this more for myself than for anyone else. Obviously, this is a very different episode of the show than anything else we've ever done on the show. So if this is not what you want from Matt Connarton Unleashed, no, no offense taken. Again, I have no idea when it's all said and done. I have no idea how many people are going to watch or listen to this episode of the show. Um, it may be a lot. It may be very few. I have no idea how to predict it, and I'm not worried about it. Again, ultimately, this is more for myself. But if you are going to and you're interested in taking this little journey with me, I appreciate you and thank you. Um, but the other night, and this is what I meant by we're going to start here and then go back. This has been on my mind for the past couple of days, and it's kind of part of why I finally decided I needed to do this now. Not necessarily for closure per se, because I kind of hate that term and I don't really believe in closure, quote unquote. But I think that maybe this will help me kind of get past the other night, because the other night I had a dream about my dad and it's stuck with me. Um, John Hopwood warned me about this, by the way. John Hopwood said that, uh, and of course, longtime listeners of Matt Connarton Unleashed are familiar with John Hopwood. But I've been seeing John Friday nights for Retro Spectrum Radio with Paulie C, because I'm also a part of that show, and John has been a part of that show recently as well. And I think he's going to be on more often, which is wonderful. Love John Hopwood. But John kind of warned me about this. He said, your father's going to visit you in your dreams. He said, it's just what happened. And I've heard other people say that too, that their parents visit them in their dreams, their parents who've passed away or other relatives who have passed away. And when he first told me that, I said, okay, well, we'll see what happens. John said his mother had never visited him after she passed away, but she did tell me that my dad would visit me in my dreams. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean my dad is going to appear in my dreams as a character in my dream that I'm having? Because I'm processing grief, and dreams are just bits and pieces of things going on in our subconscious and our unconscious minds that comes out while we're asleep. And, or does it mean that my father, is sort of a spirit somehow floating around? He's going to come into my dream and visit me or whatever. Now, before I go any further with that thought, let me just tell you this. If you don't know me, if you don't know much about me, what I believe, what I don't believe. So I will tell you up front, I am not a religious person, to the chagrin of my father. I am not a religious person. I was raised Catholic. Once I was old enough to decide whether or not to continue to go to church, I said, nope, count me out. That's a whole other subject, sort of, because my father was very devout Catholic all his life. But I won't take that side street here. But I'm not a religious person, so I don't presume that there is anything after this. Sometimes people will ask me, Matt, why do you do so much or always so busy? Why? It's like, well, because I don't think there's I don't think there's some great reward waiting for us on the other side of this. So I want to make the most of this. So I do a lot of different things, and I like to be busy. I'm a busy person, and I like it that way because I want to get the most I can out of this life, because I don't think there's another one waiting for us. I don't think there's eternity. All that being said, I am open to the idea. I was talking about this with a friend just recently. I am open to the idea that maybe our consciousness or some form of us, our energy, whatever it may be, does continue on in some way. Do I believe that there's an invisible man in the sky and we get to go be with him after we die? No offense to those of you who are religious. I try to be respectful of everyone's beliefs. Personally, I find the entire notion of it rather absurd. I'm just being honest. The show's called Unleashed for a reason, because I say what I think, like it or lump it. But I also, at the same time, I cannot deny that I have seen and experienced things over the course of my life that I don't know how to explain. So my default is to be skeptical always. especially when it comes to organized religion, because my personal belief is organized religion is used as a tool, a political tool, and has really nothing to do with God ultimately. Um, but maybe because most people are so phony about it. It's hard not to take those side streets when I start talking about this stuff. Okay, so I don't believe that you go to this magical place called heaven and you get to hang out with a deity for the rest of eternity. But I am open to the idea that you may continue on in some other form. Um, I kind of hope that that's not the case because as nice as that might sound on the surface, I kind of, Christopher Hitchens talked about this and wrote about this. He actually found the idea of an afterlife more frightening than oblivion because, you know, do you want to be just floating around for all eternity? That doesn't sound that great necessarily. I mean, what if there is an afterlife and it sucks? Yeah, maybe that's what hell would be, but what if it sucks for everybody? I don't know. So it's almost less comforting to think that you go to this other place. But so I get what I'm trying to say is when I talk about my dad coming to visit me in my dream, I'm not saying that he actually came and visited in my dream, but I'm also not saying that he didn't. I'm open to the possibility that he is on some other plane and he can come into my dreams. Probably not. It's probably just me processing my grief. That's the most logical thing. Here's what makes me wonder, though. Here's part of why when it comes to dreams, I'm open to these other things. So most dreams, people like to talk about how their dreams mean something, or their dreams are predictive in some way. They dream about things, and then it must be a psychic thing that's happening because they'll dream about something and then it actually happens and it actually comes true. Now, I don't believe any of that because for me, and I'm pretty sure this is the case for most people, my dreams are almost always just completely random. They don't make any sense. If they even have, the slightest thread of a storyline to them, it doesn't make sense. There's people in my dream, these different characters that I knew in different periods of my life who couldn't possibly exist in my life at the same time. None of it makes any sense. And then I wake up thinking, well, what the hell was that about? So my dreams don't make sense. And then I forget them. Dreams fade, and that's a natural thing for all of us, right? We wake up and whatever we were dreaming about almost immediately starts to fade away. So when you go back and try to remember that dream later, unless it's a dream that made a real impression on you, you can't even remember much of anything about the dream. That's why, there used to be this myth. I hope nobody still believes this, but there used to be this weird idea that some people dream in black and white and some people dream in color. And obviously that's bullshit. Nobody dreams in black and white. Why would you dream in black and white? Your brain is not a television. It's not an old television that, it doesn't make any sense. Why would anyone dream in black and white? But the explanation that researchers figured out is it's because for some people, when they come out of the dream, the first thing that they begin to forget is the colors. They forget the colors of the dream. So they have a perception that they were dreaming in black and white, when in reality, that's impossible. Why would you dream in black and white? Makes no logical sense. So I say all that to say, the dream I had about my father was so vivid and so real that I can't get it out of my mind, and I haven't forgotten a single detail about it. So, and that's part of why I decided to do this today, because I can't get that dream out of my mind. And I'm going to tell you what happened in the dream. And it was not a nice dream. It wasn't a nice, oh, hey, Dad, you're coming to see me in my dream. It's so good to know that you're still floating around somewhere in the ether or whatever the hell. No, it was not a nice dream. It was a nightmare. So here's what my dream was. I'm sitting in the driveway. It's dark. So it's nighttime. I'm in the car in the driveway. I look to my left and I see my father walking toward me slowly. He's walking toward the car. He's going very slow. He has a blank expression on his face, but he's looking directly at me. And I start freaking out. And I start, yeah, forgive me, there's a little bit of harsh language here. If there's any youngins listening, probably not, but I started freaking out and I started yelling at him, "What the fuck are you doing here? You're not supposed to be here. Get out of here. You are not supposed to be here. Why are you here?" And I'm screaming at him. And then, and then I started yelling for help because I didn't understand why my father, who is dead, is approaching me while I'm sitting in the car in the driveway, and I'm freaked out. And he's just got this blank look on his face, and I feel like he's so trite to say it, but it almost felt like I was trapped in a zombie movie or something. And I started yelling after I was done yelling at him to get the fuck away from me. I started yelling for help, and that's when I woke up. That dream it was so vivid and so real. The only other dream I can think of that I've ever had that was like that, and Jenny's the only person I've ever told about this. The only other dream I can have that was like that was a number of years ago. I think it was shortly after I started at WMNH. So it was quite a few years ago because I'll have been there. Geez, it'll be 9 years in April. Oh my God. Time, it goes way too fast. Um, I had a dream, and this was a positive dream, although I woke up crying because it was very moving to me. But I had a dream about a gentleman named John Donito. Now, when I was in high school, and I'm dating myself a bit here, but when I was in high school, I worked at Sears. And if there's anyone who sees this or listens from Concord, New Hampshire, you might know that Sears, at the time before it was in the Steeplegate Mall, it was on Main Street in Concord. It was a much smaller location, and I worked there. And John Donito was the manager there of the department that I worked in. And John was a great guy, just a wonderful, wonderful man. Couldn't have asked for a nicer boss. So nice, in fact, he was probably in some ways, he might have been a little too nice, just in terms of it was easy to get away with stuff. And, he didn't really like to get mad at anybody. And he probably should have, because I and the other high school age people who were working there were not always the best employees in some ways, probably. But John was a very nice man, and I would run into him even years after I worked at Sears. I would run into him occasionally. And then I found out from someone I had talked to or run into that John had passed away. He had been a smoker. He'd always been a heavy smoker, and apparently the lung cancer got him, and he passed away. And I think it was probably a year or two after that, after he died, I had a dream, and this was so vivid, and I still remember every detail about it. In my dream, I'm back in high school working at Sears in the hardware department, which will be funny to people who know me really well because I'm the most unhandy person you'll ever meet. But for whatever reason, I was working in the hardware department, and John Donito appears and walks over to me. And he said to me, and I knew he was talking about the radio show or the podcasting because so just quick backstory. When I first went to work there at Sears, I was very shy, very quiet, very quiet. I was such an introvert. I mean, I am an introvert. Technically, it's not something you necessarily grow out of. You just learn to manage it so you can do things like this. But I was very much an introvert, very shy, very quiet. Didn't express myself very much. But John, he comes over to me in this dream, and he didn't look like he looked the last time I had seen him run into him. He looked like he did when I was in high school when he hired me. And he walked over to me and he said, "Matt, I just want you to know that you were so shy and so quiet when you came to work for me, but I always knew that someday you would find your voice and that you would have a lot to say. I always knew, and I'm very proud of you. And see, even now, it's still so vivid in my mind. Even now, it affects me thinking about that dream and that moment. It's bizarre, but it still affects me now. And and then he said, "Don't ever go back to being quiet." And he said, "I'll I'll see you again someday." he kind of he kind of smiled and laughed, and he said, "But don't worry, not anytime soon," which was typical of John. And then he just went away. And then I woke up, and I woke up in tears. But that's the only other dream. So that was a nice dream to have such a vivid experience dreaming that. But but that's the only other one I can remember ever having like that. Um, I've also had instances of sleep paralysis, which I won't get into all that because that's a whole. If you've ever experienced sleep paralysis, that's like you're really having a nightmare, and it also seems very vivid and real, but there's a whole different dynamic to it that's terrifying. Um, but but no, the dream I had about my dad was not like that. The dream I had about my dad, and it's funny too, because I saw John when I saw John Friday night. This was the next day after I'd had the dream. I said to John, I said, "Well, you were right. My dad did come to visit me in my dream, and it was terrifying." And he said, "Yeah, he was probably angry with you because that's what happened." Because he said, "That's what happened to me. My dad came to visit me in my dreams, and he was angry with me at first, and eventually he wasn't." And I said, "Oh, great. So there's probably going to be more of this?" He said, "Probably." So anyway, so that kind of that's part of why I'm doing this now. I got to get this out. So let's go back a little bit. So I want to talk about my dad. Um, growing up with him, um and I am going to, because inevitably someone's going to wonder. Yes, I am going to also address the complications that arose in our relationship in more recent years, partly because again, it has to do with my show. It has to do with Matt Connarton Unleashed and the previous version of the show back when the show was on when we were on Afternoon Drive on WMNH, weekdays from 4 to 6 p.m., Monday through Friday. We were Afternoon Drive. And that iteration of the show, it was, we had musical guests like we do now, but we also did a lot of politics. And Dad and I had disagreements about that. But so I will address that. That's kind of the uncomfortable part, but it's also the elephant in the room. And it is part of the story, and I'll do so not to be I'll get into it, not to be critical of my father, but I just tell you the whole story, give you the whole picture of my dad. Um, but when I was a kid, so my parents split up when I was very young. My mom and my dad divorced. I think I was probably 6 years old, maybe seven. No, I think I was probably six. I'm not sure exactly though. We were living in Concord at the time. My mother moved to Manchester. My mother moved to an apartment that I can actually see. So weird. I can actually see from here. Um, but so she lived in Manchester for a short time, and then she ended up moving back to Chicago, Illinois, where she grew up. And that was kind of that was hard, when my dad told me that my mom was moving. Um, that was a hard thing to hear. But it kind of worked out because what happened was, so my mother moved back there per the custody. I should clarify something. Per the custody agreement, my dad had primary custody and my mother had secondary custody, if that's the right term. So what would happen, which is unusual, by the way, even at that time, usually mothers would get, if somebody was going to get primary custody, it was going to be the mother. Um, but not in this case, and we won't get into all that. Why? That's another side street that we're not going to take right now. But so my dad had primary custody, which meant my mother had me every other weekend. So every other weekend, I would come to Manchester and stay with my mother, on Friday night after school, come to Manchester, and then she would return me to my dad on Sunday evening, every other weekend. So um, that changed when my mother decided she was moving back to Illinois. So now the new thing was, obviously I wasn't going to see her every other weekend. That's a lot of back and forth to Chicago, Illinois. So now the new thing was I was going to go spend the summers with her. So basically July and August, when school was out, I would be spend those months in Chicago with my mom, which was great actually. So kind of worked out. Both my parents remarried. My mother, if I have all my facts correct, has been married and divorced 4 times. Um, my father has been married and divorced twice. Uh, that we know about. That's another story. Not even really a story because we know so little about what may have been my dad's third marriage that he kept a secret. Really is no story there to tell because we don't know. We're not sure. But so that's kind of how that worked out. So then my father is the reason, I think, maybe it would have happened anyway, even without my dad's influence, but I doubt it. The reason that I became so interested in politics, because for anyone who knows me, I've been a lifelong political junkie. I like to say, only half joking, that I became interested in politics at an unhealthy young age, but I did. I from a very young age, I was fascinated by politics. And my father, when I was growing up, so my dad had a friend, his best friend was named Dan Jordan. And Dan would come to the house a lot. And my father and Dan would have these long, wide ranging political discussions. And I would just sit there and listen to them. And I could listen to them for hours. They would just go on. And I was fascinated by all of it. And I believe it is that my exposure to that, why I grew up to be such a political junkie myself. My father at that time, and those of you who got to know my dad through the radio show more recently might be surprised to hear this, but my dad back then was a Democrat and his friend Dan was a Republican. And that was part of what made those conversations so interesting. And they would disagree on many things, probably most things. But they had such interesting and constructive conversations, and they never argued. Like nobody ever raised their voice or anything, and they got along wonderfully and they were great friends. But they would really go deep in these conversations and talk about the things where they disagreed. And I remember, I'm really aging myself here, but Dan was a big fan of Ronald Reagan, and my father despised Ronald Reagan. Again, not what you might expect if you only got to know my dad in recent years, but the only thing I can think of that my dad agreed with Reagan on was abortion, because my dad, despite being a Democrat, and from what I recall being pretty liberal when I was growing up, he did always oppose abortion. Because he was a devout Catholic. And so he seemed to kind of side with the church on that. But that was the only thing he agreed with Reagan on. And he didn't like He certainly didn't like George H.W. Bush much better, and he was furious about the Iraq War. And I mean, the first, well, not the Iraq War that happened during the W administration. He wasn't a fan of that either. But when we went in to Kuwait to kick out Saddam, to kick Iraq out of Kuwait, he was very angry about that at the time. I even remember, when the Democrats were voting to not allow the president to have authorization to go into Iraq. I remember my dad and I watching that on C-SPAN. Yeah, I know, the most politically nerdy thing ever, actually watching something on C-SPAN. And my dad making a comment to me at the time. He said, "You got to be proud of the Democrats, Maddie. They're really," he called me Maddie. He said, "They're really on the right side of this, because they were trying to prevent George H.W. Bush from sending troops into Kuwait to kick out Saddam." Operation Desert Shield, or Desert Storm. I'm sorry. It was Desert Shield, and then it became Desert Storm. Yeah, my dad was opposed to all of that. Don't get me wrong. It was a spectacularly successful mission in terms of how quick it was, getting Iraq out of Kuwait. And what was it? A few days. I mean, it was fast, but that doesn't mean it was the right thing to do necessarily, in terms of our own interests and so forth. But basically, so my dad was, when I was growing up, he was a Democrat. Now there's reasons why that is relevant. So, and my mother too. My mom, although my mother definitely to the left of my dad, my mother was very liberal when I was growing up, and still is to this day. She has not changed. My father did, but because he and Dan had all those amazing conversations that I was so riveted by, I grew up being very interested in politics. And that continued, of course, continues to this day. Although lately I don't love it like I used to. We won't get into all of that, but during, after, during adulthood, obviously I wasn't living at home anymore, but my dad and I would get together for lunch occasionally, usually like once every month or once every 2 months. We were both very busy, but we would get together, at Johnson's Dairy Bar for a long time, because I was living in Concord. He was living in Dover. And Johnson's Dairy Bar, for people who know the area in Northwood, New Hampshire, is kind of the halfway point between us. So we would meet there on a Sunday afternoon and have lunch. And I always looked forward to having, because that was the thing that bound us together, I should say. Bound us together. Was our love and fascination with politics. And I always loved talking about, because that's what we would talk about the whole time. We would talk about music too. And I'll get into that too, because it's fun to talk about my dad when talking about music, because my dad was always current. I said when I posted about this on social media, when he died, my father was the only man in his 70s I knew who still listened to college radio, specifically because he wanted to hear new music and not get stuck listening to, he never got stuck in a certain time period like most people do. But the main thing we would talk about was politics. And I always looked forward to those conversations and always cherished those discussions, because it was always interesting whether we agreed or disagreed. And we would disagree on some things. And I did notice, I had to take a sip of something here. This cold, dry air we have, all this cold weather, and now the storm is brutal. I did notice my dad was, did appear to be incrementally, but he did appear to be moving rightward. He was not as liberal as he had once been, and he seemed to be becoming more conservative. Now, we continued to have great conversations, though, because he and I could disagree on things, and we still agreed on some things to a point, right? But we could also disagree on things. And and still have a really interesting discussion. In some ways, I felt at the time that it made our discussions even more interesting because, people sitting around agreeing with each other, that's fine, but sometimes it's more intellectually stimulating to have a conversation with someone about something that you disagree about, right? And exchange those ideas and those thoughts. So I didn't mind. I mean, I was surprised by it, given how liberal he was when I was growing up. But whatever. I mean, I think there was a period where he and I were both technically independents, neither not registered with either party, so we still had that in common. But um, but he was shifting. He was shifting. Um, but then I'll tell you what. So there was a specific moment. When was the Oberfell decision? What year? I'm bad when it comes to time. It was during Obama. Wait, was that 2015? I thought it was earlier than that. Was that really 2015? Okay. For some reason, I thought it was longer ago than that. I mean, well, that's 11 years, but um, our conversation about the Oberfell decision stood out to me because we had lunch like right after this happened, right after the Oberfell decision in the Supreme Court, Oberfell versus Hodges, which effectively was the Supreme Court decision, landmark decision that legalized same-sex marriage nationwide. Prior to that, leading up to that, individual states, proud to say New Hampshire was one of them, individual states with a lot of Republicans on board with it, by the way, which is interesting. You wouldn't expect that necessarily, but at the time, there were enough Republicans who voted with Democrats in New Hampshire to legalize same-sex marriage here in New Hampshire, and libertarians and so forth. But so we were ahead of the curve here on that. But finally, in 2015, the Supreme Court, in that decision, effectively legalized same-sex marriage nationally. So my father, I wasn't sure how he was going to feel about it. I knew we were going to talk about it on my way to have lunch with him that way. And I was but I was actually looking forward to the conversation because again, I thought he might disagree as a devout Catholic man. I do think he was originally supportive of civil unions though, if I'm not mistaken, originally. Now, he might have changed his mind about that later on, too. But I think originally he was supportive of civil unions. But I suspected because of his Catholicism that he wasn't going to go that way on this. So I thought we might disagree on it. But again, I was still looking forward to the conversation, though, because I thought this will be interesting, and we can hear each other's perspectives. And I always have been, I've been consistent on this, considered myself a staunch LGBTQ plus ally. So I thought it was great. I was very pleased with the Oberfell decision. I felt like it was about time. It's funny. I do remember when I was a kid asking my mother once, I had a conversation with my mom when I was a kid I said, Mom, how come gay people can't get married? And her response was, she said something like, because she was always pretty liberal anyway. She said, well, Maddie, hopefully someday they will be able to, because everyone should have the same rights. And I don't know if I had asked my dad that same question, the devout Catholic man that he was, if he would have responded that way. He might have actually, because again, he was a lot more liberal when I was a kid, but never as liberal as my mother. So he might not have. But I do think he supported civil unions, though. But the reason this conversation specifically stands out in my mind was it was the first time during a political conversation that I remembered seeing a bit of a flash of anger toward me from my father. And it was brief. Like I said, a flash of anger. It was brief, but it struck me. I was surprised by it because up to that point, he'd never shown any anger toward me for disagreeing with him on something. But I remember he said, and he brought it up, he said, this Oberfell decision, And part of why he might have been mad is he said something that made me kind of chuckle a little bit. And I think that might have been what set him off. But because I remember this, he goes, Maddie, this Oberfeld decision, they've effectively just legalized sodomy nationwide. And I thought that was such an odd way of putting it. And it did make me kind of, maybe I smirked, or I don't know if I chuckled, but, and, cause he said that and I didn't get a chance to even get the words out. What I was thinking is, well, Dad, I think sodomy was already legal, right? I mean, maybe technically in some southern states they still have blue laws. Yeah, no sodomy on Sundays before 11 a.m. or whatever the hell. But I thought it was such an odd way of putting it that I think I might have smirked at him, not meaning to, but and I remember he goes, "Oh, you can make fun of me, but this is serious business, Matt. This is serious." And he was pissed. Again, it wasn't long. Like I said, it was a flash of anger. And then he got past it. And I just, and I told him my side of it. I said, look, I've always believed that, civil unions didn't go far enough. It was a good idea, but here's the problems with it. And I think that everyone should have the same rights. Even Dick Cheney believed that, by the way. That was the one thing Dick Cheney was always liberal on, was same-sex marriage. But, he had a gay daughter, Rob Portman, very conservative senator who has a gay son. Rob Portman's not dead. And conservative on everything else, if you look at his voting record, but always supported same-sex marriage. So I guess if you have an actual gay person in your family, the idea isn't so strange and bizarre to you. But as far as I know, those are the only conservatives who ever support gay marriage, as far as I know, are the ones who actually have a gay person in their families. Then they're able to work up a little bit of empathy. But anyway, but I remember being really struck by that. I was like, wow, my dad's never gotten angry with me like that before during a political conversation. So then, that was 2015. So we all know what happened not long after that. Trump gets in, and my father, who had been resistant to technology for so long, finally got acquainted with texting, and he would text me things, and I was surprised. He seemed to be going pretty full MAGA, and he seemed to really like Trump. Now, another weird memory, though, that I have from when I was a kid, Trump was on the cover of, I want to say it was Newsweek. It was one of the news publications that we got at home that I loved to read because, again, there was a lot of politics in them. I think it was Newsweek that had Trump on the cover. This would have been, again, I'm aging myself, but this would have been 1980 something. And it had Trump on the cover. It was during when Trump was buying up casinos in Atlantic City or whatever. And so he was in the public eye quite a bit. Trump was a celebrity long before he was president. And I remember my dad kind of mocking him and talking about, saying things like, this is the face of greed and whatnot, and talking about how he didn't think Donald Trump was a good guy and whatnot. And then here we are, a few decades later, and Dad's on the Trump train. And it was strange to me. So then so I was already doing political content and had been for a long time. Matt Connarton Unleashed, this version of the show that I'm doing right now, actually started as a podcast in 2011. Then in April of 2017, I had the opportunity to bring the show to WMNH here in Manchester. And at that point, it was a 2-hour show we were doing after drive. So I was on weekday afternoons from 4 to 6 p.m. And, we always had some musical guests, but it was mostly politics at that point. So, and I was trying to do something different because political talk radio is very heavily dominated by conservatives. So what I was trying to do is not be like just a token liberal on the radio. I was trying to bring some balance to it, and I would have conservative guests on the show and have conversations, and I would take calls from anybody who wanted to talk, really. I was coming from, being on the left. I had a particular point of view, and it's opinion journalism. It's, just like a conservative show. I express my opinions, and um, with the possible exception of the Second Amendment, because I am in New Hampshire, and that's the one issue where I'm definitely not liberal, but for the most part, I'm a pretty left leaning guy, and I would be very open with my opinions and all my thoughts on it. Oh, by the way, Texas Mike is in the chat room and says, "Love you, Matt. Appreciate being a part of your show." Thank you, Texas Mike. Yes, Texas Mike also his government name, Michael Martineau. He used to appear when I was on in Afternoon Drive. Texas Mike would appear on my show on a regular basis. That's actually where the Texas Mike persona came from. Was him being on my show, and we used to have a lot of fun. But love you too, Mikey. But so when I started on WMNH in 2017, so it was very heavy on the politics. And eventually my dad started calling into the show. He started to, I don't think he had ever listened to the podcast version of the show up to that. I don't think it was on until I was on FM radio that he really started paying attention to what I was doing and the things that I was saying and all of it. And he had gone pretty hard MAGA by this point. So he would call in and he would disagree with me on things and he would ramble. It was hard to get a word in. But I always showed him more latitude with that than I would with anybody else because it's my dad and I love him. And even though he would be calling and saying things, I mean, some of the things he would say, some of it would even, would get pretty wild, not just, typical conservative talking points, MAGA talking points, but sometimes he would veer off into conspiracy theories. And I know a lot of MAGA people are also conspiracy theorists, but he would go in some directions where it was like, geez, really? But again, I would let him say his piece because he's my dad. And if there's one person I'm not going to interrupt, talk over, mute the audio, whatever, it's my dad. Because even though I didn't like what he was saying and didn't agree with it, and even though it was hard to have an actual conversation while he was rambling, because I would have preferred that, an actual back and forth dialogue, but a lot of the time he just couldn't do it. He'd start going and it was like it was the Martin Connarton show now, which could be frustrating. But all that aside, part of me just loved that my dad who got me interested in politics in the first place, is interested enough. I don't know if he ever called other shows, but he was interested enough in what I was doing and wanted to be a part of it in some way. And was calling in, and it's not like he called in all the time, but he called in often enough that listeners began to get acquainted with my dad. And then when my dad became active on social media, listeners began to get even more acquainted with my dad and established relationships with him, parasocial relationships with my dad online. And I did like that because, I would get text messages from my dad, where he would say things like, I disagree with you on a lot of your positions, Matt, but I'm proud of you for using that platform to say what you think. And you do engage in dialogue. You don't hang up on people. You don't say, you only want to talk to people who agree with you. You actually engage in dialogue, which I did. I love to do that. I enjoy talking with people I disagree with, not as much as I used to, because now we live in a time where it seems like a lot of the people I disagree with are existing in on a different plane of reality where we can literally look at the exact same thing and have such a different interpretation of events. It's almost like, that's why I don't like argue with flat earthers, for example. It's like, what's the point? They exist on a different plane of reality. And it is very much a plane to them. It's certainly not a globe of reality. It's a plane of reality, right? So it's like, why even bother? It's like they're not living in reality. So what am I going to debate them about? There's a lot of people I won't bother with for that reason. If you exist in a completely different dimension than I do, then what do we have to talk about? I'm here on Earth 1. If you're on Earth 2, talk to other people who are living with you on Earth 2. Leave me out of it. That's kind of my that's kind of my thing. But so I got a kick out of it. There was a part of me that enjoyed. And then my dad would send me text messages and he would say, I don't agree with what you said about this. I think you're wrong about this. I think you're wrong about that. I think you're wrong about these other 10 things, but I like the way you do your show. I like the way you have dialogue. I love this is the part where he was always very positive right till the end. He was always very positive about this. He said, and I love the musical guests that you have on the show. Because again, my dad loved to hear new music. That was something where he was unwaveringly supportive with me, was my support of independent and unsigned artists in the music scene and local artists in the music scene. He was always very, very supportive on that. Because again, like I said earlier, my dad loved hearing new music. It's like I said before, if you got into a car with my dad, you would not hear an oldies station on the radio. No, you would hear whatever college radio station was in range. He lived on the seacoast. He loved to listen to WUNH, the great college station there, because he loved hearing new music. He loved having access. That's something he learned to really love about the internet, is having access to, even though he was a little technophobic, as a lot of boomers are, but he loved having access to, all this music. Just anything you want to hear, you can find, he loved it. He thought it was great. He certainly loved and appreciated the music of his youth, but he never got stuck there. My dad is the reason that indirectly that Kiss became my all-time favorite band, because when I was a kid, and Kiss was already well out of the makeup at this point, this was during the non-makeup era. But I remember this memory very clearly. I was aware of Kiss already at that point, but I hadn't really listened to them much. But I remember being in the living room one afternoon after school, and the video for Tears Are Falling from Kiss's Asylum album was on MTV. And my dad comes home from work and he kind of pokes his head into the living room and he says, "Maddie, who is that who does this song? Is that Kiss?" And I said, "Yeah, it is. It's Kiss." And he said, "Wow, I really like this song." And I said, "Yeah, me too. It's like my favorite song right now." So then that was in October of that year. So then for Christmas, he got me that album for Christmas. He got me Asylum. And then I was hooked. I think Asylum is a really underrated album. And Kiss became my favorite band from then on. But Dad and I, so we never had that sort of generational thing that so many people experience with their parents, where their parents are like, "Oh, this music you kids are listening to today is garbage." Dad and I never had that, because Dad always enjoyed music that was current. I did tell the story. I think I did tell this on the radio show, but my dad also really loved Van Halen when I was growing up. And I had borrowed the video from a friend of mine. From Bill Zappia. Hi, Billy. Billy was like my best friend for a long time growing up. And now he's a very successful musician, which I always knew he would be, because he was a very talented musician when I was growing up already. He was ahead of everyone else I knew. But Billy had loaned us a Van Halen live VHS tape. Again, I'm aging myself. Called Live Without a Net, and it was from the 5150 tour. And it was a live concert video. And Dad and I watched it together. And this is what I remember. It was a Sunday night, so it was a school night. Had school in the morning. And Dad was always pretty insistent that I went to bed on time. He wanted me to be awake and rested for school. Education was important to him. But he'd make an exception once in a while. So we watched this. We watched Van Halen Live Without a Net all the way through. We both really enjoyed it. And then my father says to me at the end of it, he goes, Maddie, do you want to watch a little bit of that again? Like maybe just the first couple of songs. I mean, he really, and dad, this was something dad and I always agreed on too. You know, I, as far as Van Halen goes, as far as frontmen, you know, the great debate, David Lee Roth versus Sammy Hagar. I love them both for different reasons, but gun to my head, I go with Sammy Hagar. I love Sammy Hagar. I love his voice. Um, Again, Roth is great in his own way for other reasons, but Sammy's got the pipes. And 5150 to this day is my favorite Van Halen album. Just one great song after another. I love that album. And my dad was always of the same mindset. So dad, at the end of this, so we watched this live without a net, this live concert video with Sammy Hagar as the frontman. And dad says to me, do you want to watch? We'll just watch a little bit of it again, just the first couple songs maybe, and then you got to go to bed. And I said, okay. So we put it on, and I knew, because I knew my dad well enough, I knew what was about to happen. We were going to end up watching the whole thing again together, because there was no way, because he'd put himself in a corner here, right? Because he says to me, and he must have known too, deep down at least. He says to me, you know, we'll just watch a couple more and then you got to go to bed. Couple, you know, first couple songs. But I knew there's no way he's going to say, okay, Maddie, you should probably get to bed now while we're in the middle of watching this. So we ended up watching the entire thing second time. I was up like 2 hours past my bedtime, but I knew dad was going to make an exception, and he did. And we watched the entire show a second time. And that was a nice memory. I've got a lot of great memories. Dad was great when I was growing up. He was never hit me. Rarely raised his voice to me. Can't say that he never did, but rarely. As my sister Lindsay put it, he was a very gentle parent, and very empathetic, and is responsible for a lot of how I am, my personality today, and my mom too. But obviously, like I said earlier, I saw a lot less of my mother growing up than I did my dad, because my dad had primary custody. But a lot of that my mother instilled in me too. But my dad, when I was growing up, he was just a good man. Um, and just instilled, values in me, speak up when you see injustice, and when you see things you don't like happening in the world, talk about it, make your voice heard. I think there may have been moments in very recent times that he might have regretted instilling some of that in me. I say that half joking. No, but I think, in terms of being empathetic and patient with people, and having dialogue with people, and trying to meet people where they are and talk things through and all that. I definitely got, again, my mother contributed too to that, because she's that way too. But I definitely got all that from my dad, primarily. So he was a good father growing up. Doesn't mean he didn't make mistakes. I have specific memories of odd things that happened or that he said or did, but nothing terrible. And those things are far, because no parent is perfect, right? I'm sure everyone has things that they look back on from their childhood, and specific moments that they think, geez, mom or dad, or maybe both of them, they didn't handle that very well. That was strange. We all have that stuff, because no parent is perfect. But my dad was a pretty good dad growing up. I always felt safe with him, and he instilled a lot of really good things in me, I think. And the two things that bound us the most were politics and music. Always, and continued to, but in kind of a different way with the politics part. And like I said, I don't want to just, because it did finally complicate our relationship in recent years. So, like I said, when he really started getting sort of involved and invested in what I was doing in afternoon drive political talk radio, and not right away either. I started at WMNH in April of 2017. I'm not sure exactly when he started calling the show. It wasn't right away, but once he started calling, he called fairly often. Sometimes he had a bad habit of calling right near the end of the show, and then it's like, "Dad, we got to go. We got to go. We got to go." Um, but there came a point where his criticisms of me in the text messages that he would send me, or in the voicemails that he would leave me occasionally, where they started to go from what could be taken as constructive criticism and sort of a, we'll agree to disagree on this. It really started to shift. Might have been during COVID, might have been a little after, because it took a while for this to really take hold. But he started getting aggressive. And again, I'm not, I'm talking about my dad, and I'm not trying to say anything negative, but I also, but I do want to give the full picture of everything of him. I think that's fair, and this is where our relationship got complicated. Um, I would get some text messages from him. I can tell you what the height of it was. Well, not the height of it even, but where it really shifted was when Roe v. Wade was overturned. He got nasty with me about it because, again, I am unapologetically pro-choice. Um, and he knew that about me. He always knew that about me. But as a devout Catholic man, and like I said, when I was a kid and dad was still a liberal, ostensibly a liberal Democrat, that was the one thing where he agreed with conservatives on. And I think his Catholicism played a big role in that. That was the one thing. He was always very pro-choice. So when Roe v. Wade was overturned, see, again, he knew my position, but now we're talking about it on the show, and I'm talking about it with other guests, and it's in his face, right? You know, he knew. He knew my position, and my position had never changed. And his position had never changed. But I think now it was like it was in his face. It was me saying these things in a very public forum and having the support of other people who agreed with me in this public forum. And and it really upset him. And very few people know this, but it got to a point. I mean, he started sending me very angry, aggressive text messages. Um, and at one point, he sent me a text message that said, um, "You have become and embraced pure evil, and I don't know you, and I don't know who you are anymore, but you are evil and you are not my son." Um, that was probably the meanest, angriest text messages I ever got from him, and I got a lot of angry, mean text messages from him in recent years. Um, that was probably the height of it, though, in terms of just nasty things to say to me. And 99% of the time, I would not respond to any of that, any of his anger. Um, but I did that time, and I just said, "What a horrible thing to say to your son, whom you supposedly love, you know, for no other reason than we disagree politically." A couple days later, I got sort of a half-assed apology, but even the apology that I got from him was kind of weird because he said, and maybe apology is being too kind, maybe excuse would be more accurate, but he said something about, "But Maddie, I've always been a masculine father, and I've always believed in tough love. That's why I was being so stern with you." And that was weird too, because number one, not only is that not a good reason to call me evil and say I'm not your son anymore and you don't know me, but also it also wasn't true. He wasn't this like super masculine father. I mean, he was, he wasn't like a tough, you know, tough love kind of, I mean, he made it sound like he was this tough guy who raised me very strictly and sternly and hit me if I got out of line and all that. I mean, that's what he made it sound like in the text. Well, I've always been a tough dad, a masculine father. It's like, no, you weren't. You weren't, dad. What are you talking about? No, I mean, he was a great dad growing up, but he wasn't like this like tough guy. He wasn't one of those dads, so that was odd to me. But I would get, from time to time after that, I would get text messages from him, not quite that mean, but he would say things like, he would sort of hint that he was disowning me. He would do this thing where he would say, you're my son. I'll always love you and I'll always pray for you, but I need to accept that you're just very different, or we're just very different. We see the world very different. Um, I mean, he would say a variation of that before, but originally he would say things like, all the great philosophers talk about how, fathers and sons, sometimes they disagree and that's just a part of the dynamic and whatnot. But now it was more like, I just have to accept that we disagree. I'll always love you and I'll always pray for you. But I just don't think, I think at one point he said, I just don't think there's any point in us talking anymore about anything. It's like, okay. Um, and I would rarely respond to any of that because I didn't know what the hell to say to it, to be frank. And it's one of those things that, now that he's passed away, it's one of those things that, those, and I guess anyone who's lost a parent probably goes through this, the regrets and the second guessing and the, now I look back and think, well, should I have said something when he would say those things? Should I have responded with, well, you're my dad and I love you no matter what? I think I might have actually said things like that at some point, but I think a lot of the time I didn't, because I was just like, again, pardon my language, I just was like, what the fuck? Why would you say these things to me? I get it. You're this hardcore MAGA dude now. And I'm not, but I can tell you, I never once texted him and said, I don't know what happened to you, dad, but like at least I don't think I did. I don't think I ever was overly judgmental or anything with him. Um, the only thing I do remember calling him on something, because at one point he said to me, again in a text message, because I wasn't picking up the phone when he was calling. I'd let it go to voicemail because I'd had enough of being, it. If you're going to call me to tell me how twisted and evil you think I am, just because I disagree with you politically, I'm not going to pick up your call every time. I don't know if you ever understood that. And maybe I should have picked up those calls more often. Again, it goes back to the, the regrets, the second guessing, all of it. But he did at one point say to me, I believe it was in a text message, he said something like, I don't know why you take these positions, Matt. I didn't raise you to think that way. And I think I did respond to him and I just said, first of all, yeah, it's coming back to me now. I think I said two things. I said, first of all, you raised me to think for myself. So of course I'm going to have my own thoughts, opinions, and ideas than you, number one. But number two, you did raise me Because again, I was raised in a household of Democrats. I said to him, you did raise me to have certain values and certain priorities and to stick up for and speak up for marginalized groups. Again, my dad, he was a devout Catholic, so he was not an LGBTQ plus advocate, shall we say. Me, I was. Why? Because my dad, Catholicism aside, my dad raised me to speak up for disenfranchised and marginalized people. So when he said to me, I didn't raise you to think this way, it's like, the fuck you didn't. Of course you did. You just don't like how it's evolved from there. But dad, you did raise me to think this way. Now, you don't want to take responsibility for it because now you're this hardcore MAGA dude. That's fine. I don't need you to take responsibility for it. But, but but you played a role in it, how I turned out. If you're at a point now in your life where politically you think having empathy for people and looking out for people is somehow a weakness instead of a strength, which you raised me to believe it is, that's on you. That's not my fault that you've now kind of become this other dude. So I think because I think it was that specific text when he said that to me. I didn't raise you to think this way. It's like, no, yeah, you did. And I'm glad you did. And thank you. You might not be happy with the end result, but this is how I am. This is who I am. But it would go through phases too. So he'd get pretty nasty and angry, but then he'd kind of back off of it. And there were even times where he would try to focus on, there was one thing where we always agreed, when I was growing up, that he instilled in me, and that we agreed on, as far as I know, he never changed positions until the day that he died. And that was the death penalty. Dad and I were always completely against the death penalty. And that's something where he never, that's one issue where he never did go MAGA. As far as I know, he always was opposed to the death penalty. But that's how our relationship got complicated. And I'll never know for sure, but I think in his mind, I sort of became the avatar for everything that was making him so angry, because he'd call me, I remember at one point in a text message, he said, he called me a typical woke liberal. And, because conservatives think being called a woke liberal is an insult. I don't take it that way, but it's like, thank you. But he called me a woke liberal, and it's like, okay. But again, I'm there are things that I care about and that I'm passionate about and that I say on my show. But now to him, and I remember that comment specifically. It's like, because he used that word typical, and I remember thinking, I think that everyone in the media who he hates, everybody on MSNBC and, whoever else, right? Now it's MS now, but whoever he hates, whoever he's angry at, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, sorry. Gavin Newsom, Chuck Schumer, whoever. I think he was directing all of it at me. I now represented all of that to him in his mind. And part of why I think that too is because he would say weird stuff to me. Like, I remember one point getting a text message from him saying, you support AOC, and I don't know how you can support her, and she's an idiot. And I remember reading this text from him and thinking, when was the last time I even talked about AOC on my show? Like, I couldn't remember. Yeah, it was a weird moment, because I remember reading that text and going, what is he talking about? Because he's making it sound like I was talking about her on my show today. I can't even remember the last time her name came up on my show. Or he would say, like, you love Chuck Schumer. And it's like, no, actually, I don't. I think Chuck Schumer should have retired a long time ago. I don't think he should be in the position that he's in the Democratic Party. He's he's an old guard establishment Democrat, and he's not helpful to anything at this point. And I have nothing. And then I started remembering, have I ever said anything positive about Chuck Schumer on my show? When was the last time I even talked about Chuck Schumer? But he's like, but he would just say this stuff like, you support this person, you support that person. People I never even really talked about. In some cases, people I viscerally dislike, like Chuck Schumer. No use for him. But he would say these things like, you support him, or who else? I'm trying to think of another example. But it would get weird. Like what is he talking about here? So I think he just got red pilled, but red pill on steroids. So I say all that to say, and again, I'm not trying to say anything negative, because that was not the point of this. I wanted to talk about my dad, to honor him, because I loved my father very much. Love, present tense. I love my father very much. Probably more so the version, pre him getting so angry with me, but more. Love that version of him more. But I always loved my father right to the end. Seeing him in that hospital bed was horrific. Seeing him lying there unconscious, it's horrifying, Um, and I know that he loved me, and even when he was angry with me, I know that he loved me. But but I did want to present the whole picture too. Um, and there were some, but look, I mean, when the show moved to Saturdays and we took the politics out of the radio version of the show, the WMNH version, and started focusing more on just interviews with musicians and other and discussing other subjects going on in the music industry. I think he probably missed being able to call in, because obviously there's really no room for callers on that version of the show, with rare exception on the current iteration. But it may have been a relief to him too, in a sense, because I did notice, because he would text me and say very nice things about the Saturday show, very positive, encouraging things, talking about how he would say, Matt, there's so much incredible talent out there, and you're highlighting it, and it's great. You're doing such a wonderful job with that. Hello to Gamer James in the chat, watching on Twitch, I believe. Oh, there's a quote here from Gamer James. Kenneth Boilding, I don't know who that is, said, quote, anyone who believes in indefinite growth in anything physical on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist. Well, I have no idea what that has to do with anything, but it's a very interesting thought. Okay. I do appreciate the interaction regardless. Please don't think I don't. So there was a lot of positive feedback from my dad. But then, of course, if I did something political on this version of the show, or on Hanging Left, the show that I do with Todd Ayer, or even on Tough Bumps, the show that I do with Eric Pilcher, which is all about professional wrestling, Dad was upset about some of our comments about Hulk Hogan after he passed away, because Eric in particular, I tried to be a little more measured. Eric had some very negative things to say about Hulk Hogan, and Dad was mad about that. But all that kind of falls away, when you get a call from him saying, Maddie, I'm in the hospital. It's my heart. It's my dad. I think he was 67 when he had his first heart attack, and then he had a second one a few years ago, and had to have open heart surgery and the whole deal, and recovered both times. This time, he went to Wentworth Douglas because he was living in Dover, and then he was in total heart failure. And they, I don't know if they use the word total. That doesn't make sense, does it? Because if he was in total heart failure, he probably would have died right away. But severe heart failure. And they ended up transferring him to Mass General. And I can tell you this. I do take some solace in the fact that he was at one of the best hospitals in the country with one of the best cardiac teams in the country, Mass General in Boston, because I know that he had, let me put it this way, if they couldn't save him, if the team there couldn't save him, and they loved my dad, by the way. One of the doctors told me on the phone, he said, he's the most pleasant person here and everyone loves him, loves talking to him. So he was a very good patient. Didn't surprise me, actually. But apparently the television stayed off too. There was no Fox News while he was there in that hospital bed. I wonder how different he might have been if but I don't think he wanted it. I think he just wanted to focus on the positive as he was trying to get better. But if they couldn't save him, this is the point of what I'm saying. If they couldn't save him, nobody could, in one of the best hospitals in the country. If Mass General couldn't save my dad, nobody could save my dad. So, that does give me a little bit of peace of mind knowing that, he wasn't at, some backwoods, podunk, medical facility in, Backwater, Alabama or something, Bob's Hospital in, backwoods, Alabama. No, he was in one of the best hospitals in the country. If they couldn't save him, no one could save him. And he fought bravely for, I think it was almost 2 months from start to finish from when Wentworth Douglas transferred him there to when he passed away. He was there for a long time. So he fought bravely until he couldn't. And that was it. So I appreciate anyone who sat through all of this, because I think we've kind of exhausted it. The one other thing that I will say, and I did say this on social media, and I want to repeat it here too. And if Lindsay or Ryan or both, if they happen to watch this or listen to this, silver line. This is all going to sound very cliche. I apologize, but because I try not to be cliche. But if there is a silver lining to any of it, it's that I've reconnected with them. My family became, I didn't talk about this part at all, but my family became pretty fractured. What year would it have even been? Sometime in the 90s when my stepmother, Debbie, left my dad and moved back to New York with my sister Lindsay and my brother Ryan. They're half siblings, so it was, we had the same dad, different mothers. They're from my father's second marriage, and they and as happens in a lot of families, it's just so we were in different places geographically. And then life kind of takes over and everyone goes on whatever path they're on. And sometimes families lose touch. And I will be the first to admit and acknowledge that when it comes to keeping in touch with people, even members of my own family, I'm not good at it. I have an incoming call from Dr. Kevin. I'm not sure why he's calling. I haven't heard from Dr. Kevin in a long time. I'm not sure why he's calling me right now. Unless he's watching the live stream, but and wants to join the conversation. But Kevin, I don't really have any way to answer it. I mean, I have a way to answer it, but I don't have any way to import the audio unless he wants me to put him on speaker. Well, let me finish this thought. And I love Dr. Kevin. No disrespect at all. He's a great guy. Um, but you know, I'm really glad to have reconnected with my sister Lindsay and my brother Ryan. They're both remarkable people, and yeah, they came out. We had to clean out Dad's apartment. They came out here, and we did that together. But and Lindsay's husband Gary, also, I got to meet him for the first time. Just a great guy. Very positive attitude, positive vibe. And of course, their two children, who I had not met prior, and my stepmother Debbie, who I hadn't seen in decades. That was wild. Seeing her again, it's like, wow, and it's strange. Like, so much time can pass since you've seen somebody, and then, like, literally decades, and then you're there in the room with them, and it's like nothing's changed in a way, you know? Again, it all sounds very cliche and trite, and I try not to be that way. uh, but, um, but it was wonderful to, the night before we had dinner, and we all had dinner together, and that was nice. And like I said, they've turned out to be remarkable people, and who have done a lot of the heavy lifting in this process too. Um, which I'm grateful for. You know, and then there's, like I said too, then there's all the regrets and second guessing and kind of feeling like I shouldn't, because there was never any estrangement between my siblings and I, none, not at all. It was never like that. No problem or anything. Uh, we just, you know, we're not even that. I mean, what, 5 hours where they live? Is it 5 hours from here? 6 hours from here? But people, they just end up on their own paths. And I also think too, there's this phenomenon where I think social media makes it a little easier than it used to be to kind of take people for granted, because it almost feels like if you can see them online, if you can see them on social media, then that sort of becomes almost like a replacement for keeping in touch with them. You don't feel like you're not in touch with that person because you like their Facebook post or something, and that sort of becomes good enough. And it's really a way of taking them for granted, and I am as guilty of that, if not more so than anybody, and I feel terrible about that. But getting to see them and seeing the remarkable people they've become was a real blessing. And it sucks that it took Dad passing away for that to happen. But at least it happened, getting to see them. And it's funny, I got to the that night before we had to clean out Dad's apartment. I got to the restaurant. We met up in Portsmouth, and I got to the restaurant before them. And then as they're getting out of the vehicle, I just that was a cold night, actually, not as cold as it's been recently, but that was a cold night. And I just so I was waiting inside, but as they pulled up and they're getting out of the vehicle, I just kind of opened the door to the restaurant. I poked my head out and I said, "Hi, are you my family?" I knew it was them, but it was surreal. It really was, but in the best possible way. So I was nervous. I was nervous about it, but then being there with them, like once they got there, and everyone's hugging and everything, then, whatever nervousness or apprehension I felt was just gone, completely gone. Just like, oh, here we are. This is how it's supposed to be. We're all supposed to be together. Just felt really natural, and it was good. And we had a nice meal together. Um, so there will be a service, I believe in May, with the full military honors and everything for my dad, because he was a veteran. Um, he was in the Navy during the Vietnam War. There was going to be something else, but in New York, and that's where he'll be buried too, in New York State, because ultimately, I mean, he had more family out there than he had here. Um, and but the decision was made to cremate him. Um, but again, there will be an official funeral service in May, I believe, May or June, I think is what Gary had said. But they decided to cremate him, and which is fine with me. I mean, I personally, I can tell you, I've always found it kind of interesting that people tend to be so concerned with that, or what's going to happen to their body after they die. You'll often hear people say, well, I want to be buried. I want to be buried in such and such a place with, or they'll say, well, I don't like the idea of being in the ground. I want to be cremated, and then you can scatter my ashes in the ocean, or put me on your mantle, or whatever. And I just always thought it's kind of interesting that people are so concerned with that. I personally couldn't care less like what you do with me after I die. If you want to take me and dump me in the river, you can. I mean, you probably can't. I'm sure that's extremely illegal. But, if you wanted to have some fun with it and make it look like it was a mob hit, go ahead. Because I got news for you. I'm not going to know. You know what I mean? When I die, my ego will die with me. So I've always said, I could not give a shit less what you do with me after I die. Because to me, it's like, or it's like with, like, I don't understand. And again, I don't mean this. I'm not criticizing anyone when I say any of this. Everyone has their own way of dealing with death and grief and all of it. So, however you want to do it is your deal. I'm not trying to make fun of anybody or criticize anybody, but like, I don't do the open casket thing. Like, if I go to a funeral and there's an open casket, or a wake, I'm not going to go over to where the body is and say my last goodbyes and whatnot. I don't do that. I avoid that. I personally think it's a bit morbid. Again, everybody do your own thing. This is an unpopular opinion that I have. I'm an odd case on this, but I just don't want to ever do that. Because to me, that body, that's not them. That's now a shell that used to contain them, their essence, their consciousness, their soul, if you believe in that, whatever. But once they die, that's no longer them. It's now just a dead body. So I don't need to go and hang out with a dead body and say bye. like to me, it's weird. But again, that's me. I'm unusual. I understand people need that. People need that for closure, whatever it is. That's how you process grief. You go, you see the body, you say goodbye. I've never done that. No, thank you. Again, that's me. I don't understand the open casket thing. I don't understand having a wake. And again, it's recorded, it's documented. So, if when I die, you do decide to throw me in a river, you have, no jury will convict you, because I'm sure it's very illegal to do that. Because I am on record saying you have permission to do that. There you go. You can eat me if you want to. If you're a cannibal and I'm dead and I look delicious to you, you go ahead. I do not give a shit, because I won't know. I mean, assuming look, if there's no afterlife and it's just, that's it, lights out, I won't know anything. And if I'm wrong and there is an afterlife, well, hopefully at that point I have bigger fish to fry than worrying about, whether, what happened to the carcass that used to contain me. That's how I feel about it. All right. I think I have exhausted this, and I'm glad I finally did it. And if there's anyone who actually sat through the whole thing, thank you. So that's my kind of my memorial to Martin James Connarton, my father, passed away at the age of 78. December 18th, 2025 at Mass General Hospital. And, I may talk about him more in the future if something comes up that maybe I wanted to say that I forgot or anything like that. But otherwise, I think that's it. If you are watching or listening to this live on Sunday night and you're wondering about this week's episode of Tough Bumps, Eric wanted to skip this week because he's been very, very busy. So we have taken this week off, but Tough Bumps will return next week, I believe. And of course, if you missed this week's radio show, that is up and available. You can get that. Please subscribe on your podcast platform of choice. And if you want to keep up with everything I'm up to or learn more about me or just find out how to reach me, go to my website, mattconnarton.com. And if you're watching the video of this, it's even on the screen. So there you go. All right. I think that's it. Love to you all. Thank you. And stay safe. Again, if you're, if you have to travel anywhere and you're still in where this terrible weather system is occurring, please